But how many of you understand why it's important? Nobody? Okay, so that's why I'm here to talk to you guys today, because I feel a lot of us don't understand why it's so important to have a good sense of self-love within yourself. And I learned about the importance of it through my own journey, because these were the things I struggled with when I was your age and throughout high school and part of college. And one of the main things I realized was that your self-love, or the lack thereof, directly affects how you show up in the world. And what I mean by that is it affects how you present yourself in a place other than home, essentially. Because when you're at home, you're surrounded by the people who love you, who you're comfortable with, and who you grew up around, right? So you're not afraid to be yourself because you know that they know you and they love you. But when you come to a place like school, where you're surrounded by people who you don't know very well, it's not necessarily the case, right? You don't feel as comfortable because you don't know these people as well. And so whenever you have a lack of self-love, then it kind of makes you feel not so comfortable in being able to show every single part of yourself, right? Because you start to feel kind of insecure and start to worry too much about what people think. At least that's how I felt about it. And so I remember being, your age and being so afraid to be myself around other people. And so much so to the point that I basically put a wall up between myself and the people around me. And it was because I was just so afraid to be seen, because I felt that I would get rejected. And I realized this whenever I was 21 and when I was in college. And the way I ended up figuring this out was by going to therapy that year. I ended up going through a very hard time in my life, and I had to seek out help because I couldn't do it by myself anymore. And I felt how much it was bogging me down. And it didn't have to do with, self-love and all of these things. It was something completely different. But what I learned by going to therapy was about all of these deep-rooted issues and where it was coming from. And I realized that one of the big reasons why I was so afraid to be myself around people and why I had become so shy was because of a time that I was bullied in elementary school. And what happened was I was basically rejected by these people around me. And so having gone through that, I became afraid of that sort of rejection again, and I didn't want to feel it again. And so what I did was I just became shy and afraid to be myself, because then that way nobody could know who I was or truly see me. So I was essentially protecting myself from that kind of rejection again. However, the bad part about that is that I continued feeling terrible about myself. Feeling that sort of rejection made me feel that like I wasn't enough. And so then that started taking from my self-worth. And so then I started believing that I wasn't enough for anybody or for anything, not even for myself. And it all came back to that, to believing what somebody else had told me or had done to me and allowing it to have power over me. And so once I had realized that, I saw how much one thing in my life had dictated so much of the rest of the time. Because when I was in elementary school, when that happened, I was maybe 9 or 10, and here I am at 21, still struggling to be myself, to not be shy, and to truly love myself for who I was. And so when I realized all of these things, I decided to start working on it because I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I didn't want to struggle in that way. And so once I started doing that, I started seeing how it was positively affecting other areas of my life. And so I realized that your self-love, like I said, affects your sense of self-worth. And so when you don't have a good, deep sense of self-love within yourself, it's going to take away from your sense of self-worth, and it's going to take away from your confidence. Because if you don't feel good about yourself and you don't feel like you love yourself and that like you're enough, you're not going to be able to show up very confidently, are you? No, right?
No.
And so those were all things I struggled with. And so once I realized that, I started working on it in order to pull myself out of that, because I didn't want to be afraid to be myself anymore and care so much about what other people thought. And so one of the things that I did that really helped me during this time was affirmations. Does anybody know what affirmations are? No? Okay. So affirmations are positive statements you say about yourself to yourself in the mirror. And so what I would do is I would write down different affirmations for myself, and every single morning before I went to class, I would say them to myself in the mirror. And I made it part of a morning routine that I did every single day. And over time, I got to see how that positively impacted the way I felt about myself. Because the way we think about ourselves, or the way we feel about ourselves, comes down to what we constantly tell ourselves, right? And the thoughts we have in our heads about ourselves. And so if that's a very negative thing, if we constantly think about ourselves negatively, then the way we start changing that is by telling ourselves positive things, right? And so when you do this and you speak to yourself in a positive and more loving way, you start teaching your mind how to start thinking more positively about yourself. The only thing with this, though, is that you have to give it time and you have to be consistent with it, because it's not going to make a big difference for you if you do it one time and then don't do it again, because one time is not going to make a huge difference from one day to the next. It took me about, I would say, 2 months of consistently doing this every day for me to see a huge difference in the way I felt about myself. But it was worth it. And when you think about it, that time is going to pass by anyway, so why not do something to benefit yourself with that time? And so what I recommend you do is take about 2 to 5 minutes one day and just write down these affirmations to yourself. And you can think about them as being I am statements. And so you put I am, and then you fill in the blank. And some of mine that I've used since then and still to this day are words like I am enough, and I am loved, and I am strong, I am powerful. And those kind of uplifting words that are just going to make you feel better about yourself. And like I said, over time, it'll make a difference for you. And you'll start to see how speaking to yourself in this way adds to your sense of self-love, your sense of self-worth, and your confidence. And once you start feeling more confident in yourself and feeling that self-love, it becomes easier not to care so much about what people think. Which leads me into my next topic, which is on our need to release external validation.